What happens when a nation forgets how to build, yet remembers how to consume? What happens when pride in production is replaced by addiction to convenience? The answer isn't just economic decline, it's cultural decay.
Ouch.
And today, as the United States moves toward collecting $50 billion a month in tariffs, we are not just making a policy decision, we are standing at the edge of an identity crisis, and possibly a national awakening. Asterisk, you cannot play games with reality and expect to win. That phrase is more than rhetorical fire. It's a fundamental truth grounded in centuries of philosophical thought and hard-earned historical experience. At its core, it expresses a deep recognition that reality, economic, social, moral, doesn't bend to our desires, ideologies, or feelings. There are structures that govern human behavior, market function, and societal stability. These structures aren't inventions, they're discoveries. They exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Ignoring them carries consequences, serious ones, in the economic sphere. This means that actions like printing endless currency, outsourcing core industries, or depending on exploitative trade relationships do not come without repercussions. A nation cannot perpetually consume more than it produces or import more than it exports without suffering long-term structural decay. These truths might be politically inconvenient, but they are true nonetheless. We can mask them with rhetoric. We can delay their arrival with borrowed time and borrowed money. But eventually, the bill comes due. And when it does, it's not negotiable. This principle also applies to individuals, to families, and to cultures. When a society begins to believe that effort doesn't matter, that responsibility is optional, or that hard limits can be circumvented by clever policy or wishful thinking, it's sowing seeds of disintegration. Systems break down not because of one dramatic collapse, because the small truths are ignored repeatedly, because short-term comfort is prioritized over long-term stability. Economic reality doesn't care about our intentions. It cares about cause and effect. You either engage with the world as it is, or you suffer the consequences of pretending it's something else. In the context of the United States anticipating $50 billion in monthly tariff revenue, the reality principle becomes even more urgent. That revenue will be interpreted by many as a success, perhaps even a triumph. But success, real success, is not simply about numbers going up. It's about alignment with reality. Are these tariffs part of a coherent strategy rooted in national interest, production, and sustainability? Or are they a desperate attempt to correct decades of strategic laziness and moral abdication? Those are uncomfortable questions, but discomfort is the price of truth. Serious nation must ask them. The laws of trade, like the laws of gravity, don't yield to hope. If a country ships its manufacturing base overseas, guts its industrial towns, and fills the void with cheap consumer goods and government programs, it will not thrive. It will hollow out. That's not opinion. It's not ideology. It's observable, measurable, and repeatable. There's no cheat code for escaping that pattern. When you play games with that kind of reality, you lose every time. Not immediately, not always dramatically, but inevitably. And when you lose, it's not the elite class or the bureaucrats who suffer most. It's the average citizen. It's the working family. It's the community that's told their struggles are unfortunate, but necessary for efficiency. An announcement that the United States expects its monthly tariff revenue to rise to $50 billion is not a mere statistical development. It is a deeply symbolic moment. A signal broadcast not just to economists and policymakers, but to the world. Numbers of this magnitude don't just exist in abstraction. They reflect choices, philosophies, and shifts in national direction. The $50 billion figure is less about the sum itself, and more about what it reveals. A reassertion of economic boundaries. A deliberate recalibration of how America engages with the global market. And a potential reawakening of national priorities that have long been obscured by the promises of global integration. This projected rise in tariff revenue suggests that the United States is beginning to place a price tag on access to its markets. That in itself is a powerful act of self-definition. For decades, trade policy in the Western world, particularly in the United States, has been shaped by an almost religious devotion to open markets and borderless commerce. This ideology, while delivering short-term benefits, also hollowed out key industries, weakened domestic production, and left millions of American workers exposed to forces they could neither predict nor control. The shift toward generating $50 billion in tariff revenue monthly is not a tweak to the system. It is a signal that the terms of engagement are being rewritten. Signals matter. It's in economics. As in life, they communicate intentions, boundaries, and seriousness of purpose. This signal tells foreign producers, global corporations, and even domestic elites that the United States is no longer willing to subsidize a trade structure that erodes its own foundation. It's a declaration that market access is no longer free, that there is a cost for bypassing domestic labor, for outsourcing production, and for exploiting imbalanced trade relationships. It's not a retreat from the world. It's a strategic repositioning within it. But this figure also communicates something internally. To the American people, it sends a message that the nation is reevaluating what it values economically and morally. Tariffs, especially on this scale, imply a willingness to protect and prioritize domestic industries. To take the long view rather than chase short-term consumption gains, it suggests a seriousness about rebuilding what was lost, about investing in the physical and moral infrastructure of American life. Manufacturing, work ethic, resilience. And while some will criticize this approach as protectionist or regressive, the signal embedded in this policy is much deeper. It is about reasserting the idea that a country is allowed, indeed, it's obligated to protect its own capacity to thrive. This is not simply an economic pivot. It's a psychological and cultural one. $50 billion a month is not an accident, or a byproduct of market forces acting independently. It is the direct result of human decisions, shaped by values and guided by consequences. And in the world of geopolitics and economic statecraft, those decisions speak louder than any speech or treaty. Asterisk tariffs are too often reduced to technicalities, lines on a ledger. Policy tools used to balance trade deficits or protect domestic industries, but that narrow framing misses something vital. Tariffs at their core are not just economic devices. They are moral statements. They are declarations about what a nation values, what it will defend, and what it will no longer tolerate. A tariff is not simply a tax on imported goods. It is a boundary. It draws a line in the sand between what is acceptable and what is not, between exploitation and fairness, between dependency and sovereignty. When a country imposes tariffs, it is making a moral claim that there are certain practices, relationships, and outcomes that are no longer aligned with its identity or its vision for the future. This isn't just about economics. It's about justice, dignity, and the right to determine one's own destiny. If a nation has been flooded with cheap goods, produced under conditions that would be illegal or immoral at home, then placing a tariff on those goods is not an act of hostility, it is an act of conscience. It says, we will not continue to participate in systems that degrade labor, destroy communities, and outsource responsibility. Moreover, tariffs function as a counterbalance to the weightless ideology of globalism, which insists that all markets must be open, all borders must be porous, and all production must follow the path of least resistance. But the path of least resistance rarely leads to strength. It leads to erosion. It leads to the dismantling of local industries, the demoralization of working-class citizens, and the concentration of wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. Tariffs disrupt that flow. They insert friction, purposeful, intentional friction, to a system that has been running on autopilot for decades, and that friction is necessary. It forces reflection. It forces recalibration. There is a deeper principle at work here, the idea that a healthy economy must be rooted in reciprocity. Trade is not inherently virtuous. It is virtuous only when it benefits both sides in a sustainable and respectful way. When trade becomes extractive, asymmetrical, or corrosive, it is no longer virtuous, it is predatory. Tariffs are one way a nation can push back against that kind of imbalance. They say, we are not open for exploitation. We will not sacrifice long-term vitality for short-term affordability. We are willing to bear some immediate cost in order to preserve something greater, our ability to produce, to work, and to shape our own future. A tariff, then, is a moral articulation. It is a society standing up and saying, we choose something higher than convenience. We choose the dignity of labor over the seduction of cheapness. We choose to protect what is ours, not out of fear or anger, but out of an understanding that identity requires defense. Boundaries are necessary not just in politics, but in economics. And placing them is not an act of regression, it is a recognition of responsibility. Every economic decision comes with a cost, and tariffs are no exception. The projection of $50 billion in monthly tariff revenue may sound like a triumph. But that figure is not magic, it's money collected from someone, somewhere. And more often than not, that someone is the everyday consumer, the small business owner, the importer, the working class family. To understand the meaning behind that number, we must resist the temptation to view it as a simple gain. It is also a burden, redistributed across the economy. Absorbed in the form of higher prices, tightened margins, and recalibrated behavior. It is a choice, and like all meaningful choices, it comes with trade-offs. This is not an argument against tariffs, but it is a reminder that reality imposes limits. You cannot insulate your economy without bearing certain consequences. When tariffs are levied on foreign goods, those costs often pass down the supply chain. Products become more expensive. Alternatives may be limited. Inflationary pressure may rise. These are not theoretical possibilities. They are patterns well documented in economic history. To pretend otherwise is to enter a fantasy in which action has no consequence, a mindset that has led to many of the crises we now face. But cost is not the enemy. Sacrifice, in fact, is often the precondition for renewal. The deeper question is not whether tariffs cost money, it's whether what is gained is worth what is paid. And that's a moral question. Are we willing to accept some higher prices? If it means revitalizing our domestic industry, are we willing to forego some cheapness in the short term to regain the dignity of making things for ourselves again? Are we prepared to shoulder discomfort now in order to reclaim strength later? These are not simple yes or no propositions, and they are not uniformly felt across the population. But they must be asked. In the modern economy, we've grown accustomed to the illusion that comfort and prosperity can be achieved without effort. We're told we can consume endlessly, live beyond our means, and borrow against the future without consequence. Tariffs shatter that illusion. They reintroduce the concept of limits of friction. They remind us that protection comes at a price. That independence is not free, and that strength must be purchased not just in currency, but in discipline. The burden of tariffs is real, but so is the burden of dependency. The choice is not between pain and ease. It's between pain now with meaning and pain later without preparation. For policymakers, the challenge lies in communicating this honestly. It is not enough to celebrate the revenue. Leaders must acknowledge the cost, justify it with a compelling vision, and take steps to cushion those who will feel it most. For citizens, the challenge is equally real: to resist the impulse for immediate gratification and to recognize that long-term renewal often requires short-term discomfort. If the nation is to shift its trajectory, to restore its industrial base, to build resilience, to reclaim self-determination, it must be willing to bear the weight of that choice. Asterisk, for decades, the prevailing narrative told Americans that global integration was the inevitable and beneficial path forward. We were told that outsourcing was efficient, that free trade was morally superior, and that goods would become cheaper for everyone. What wasn't emphasized, what was quietly ignored, was the cost of that approach. The systematic dismantling of domestic industry, the closing of factories, the death of skilled trades, and the erosion of the very communities that once formed the backbone of the American middle class. A nation that once built things, invented things, and exported the fruits of its labor was slowly transformed into a nation that consumed what others produced. That transformation came with a price, not measured solely in GDP, but in dignity, stability, and self-reliance. The shift toward tariffs, toward economic self-assertion, represents a necessary rejection of this dependency. It is a conscious step away from a model that prizes convenience over resilience and speed over substance. When we allowed entire industries to be relocated to foreign soil in exchange for lower prices, we didn't just export jobs, we exported knowledge, control, and the ability to shape our own economic destiny. We became reliant on long, fragile supply chains, many of them controlled by nations that do not share our values or our interests. That is not efficiency. That is vulnerability masquerading as modernity. There is something deeply corrosive about a national economy that forgets how to make things. It doesn't just lose technical expertise, it loses cultural memory. Generations who once took pride in building, crafting, and producing are now told that their future lies in service sector. Jobs or abstract financial work, far removed from tangible creation. That message breeds despair, especially in communities that once thrived on skilled labor. It tells people they are replaceable, that their work has no enduring value, that they must adapt to a world that no longer needs them. This is not progress. This is alienation disguised as adaptation. Rejecting global dependence is not about isolationism or fear. It is about balance. It is about regaining the capacity to stand on our own feet, to produce essential goods within our own borders, and to protect the strategic core of our economy from external manipulation. There is nothing reactionary about wanting your country to be strong, capable, and self-sufficient. In fact, it is the most forward-thinking choice a nation can make, especially in an era where geopolitical tensions are rising and supply chains are constantly at risk of disruption. This pivot also sends a message to future generations. It says, you don't have to leave your hometown to find opportunity. You don't have to abandon your identity to be relevant. You don't have to accept that all meaningful work happens somewhere else. There is dignity in creation. There is purpose in production. And there is something deeply human about building the world around you. A society that understands this does not fear the reindustrialization of its economy. It welcomes it not as a nostalgic return to the past, but as a foundation for a stronger, more independent future. Asterisk, the idea of reclaiming national identity through economic policy may seem abstract, but in reality, it is one of the most concrete and consequential actions a country can take. Economic decisions shape culture, and culture shapes identity. When a nation chooses to prioritize domestic production, local labor, and internal resilience, it is not simply engaging in trade management, it is engaging in cultural reconstruction. It is saying, in no uncertain terms, that it matters where things come from, who makes them, and under what conditions they are made. It is an assertion of values, an act of remembering, and in many ways, an act of defiance against the forces that seek to dissolve borders, flatten traditions, and reduce nations to marketplaces. For years, the phrase "Made in America" was more than just a slogan. It was a mark of pride. It stood for quality, reliability, and self-reliance. It stood for the idea that a nation should provide for itself, that its workers should be respected, and that its industries were part of its soul, not just its economy. As globalism expanded, that phrase became rarer, and with its decline came a subtle but significant loss of confidence. A society that no longer makes its own goods begins to forget its own capabilities. It starts to view production as something beneath it, something better left to others. That mindset is corrosive, not just economically, but psychologically. To reclaim the meaning of "Made in America" is to reawaken the national character. It is to remember that the strength of a country lies not just in its financial systems or technological innovations, but in the hands of its workers and the productivity of its people. When an economy is built on creation rather than consumption, it fosters a sense of ownership, contribution, and purpose. It connects people to something larger than themselves. It gives them a reason to care about their communities, to invest in their surroundings, and to take pride in what they do. Rebuilding domestic industry is not a nostalgic gesture. It is a forward-looking necessity. In an increasingly unstable world, reliance on foreign supply chains is a liability. And more than that, dependence on goods produced under conditions we would never tolerate at home raises serious ethical concerns. By bringing production back to our own soil, we not only secure our economy, we also align our practices with our principles. We stop outsourcing our responsibilities, stop turning a blind eye to exploitation in the name of savings. We begin to walk with integrity again. This is about more than economics. It's about restoring the link between identity and labor, between place and product, between citizen and country. When people see that their work contributes to something real and lasting, when they can point to the goods they helped create and say, "I was part of that," it changes how they see themselves and how they see their nation. That is not sentimentality. That is the bedrock of a functioning, proud, and unified society. Whenever a nation dares to reassert control over its economic destiny, there will be pushback. Resistance is inevitable, not just from foreign competitors, but from within. Global institutions, media outlets, academic circles, and multinational corporations often sound the alarm, warning that protectionist policies will trigger retaliation, inefficiency, or decline. They frame any deviation from the globalist consensus as backward, isolationist, or dangerous. And yet, this reflexive opposition misses something essential: the courage required to break with the status quo and pursue a new path, especially when that path challenges entrenched interests and ideologies. The shift toward higher tariffs and economic nationalism is not occurring in a vacuum. It is emerging from decades of lived experience, decades in which many Americans watched their communities decline, their factories close, and their job prospects disappear, all while being told it was for the greater good. The intellectual class insisted this was progress. The media praised efficiency and openness. Corporations cheered the swelling of their bottom lines. But the people who bore the brunt of those decisions were rarely asked how they felt about it. Their sacrifices were written off as the necessary casualties of modernity. Now that a different approach is being pursued, one that prioritizes domestic production, national sovereignty, and economic resilience, those same institutions are quick to condemn it. They invoke the same arguments they always have, appealing to theoretical models and forecasting doom. But a nation cannot be governed solely by models. It must be governed by reality, and reality shows us that the globalist model did not deliver its promises for everyone. It created prosperity for the few while destabilizing the many. It fractured communities, hollowed out industries, and made national economies vulnerable to external shocks. To stand firm in the face of this criticism requires strength, political, moral, and cultural. It demands that leaders speak not just to spreadsheets, but to people's lived experience. It requires them to hold the line, even when elite opinion turns against them. The truth is, those who benefit from the current system will always resist its transformation. They will say it cannot be done. They will argue that it will fail. They will insist that nothing can be changed without catastrophic consequence. But they are defending their interests, not the interests of the nation. Real change is never applauded at its inception. It is ridiculed, feared, and undermined. Only after it begins to bear fruit, after the foundations have been rebuilt and the outcomes have shifted, do the critics begin to revise their positions. In the meantime, a nation that seeks to protect its sovereignty must be willing to absorb the pressure. It must not flinch every time a foreign government issues a warning or a major publication runs a scathing editorial. Economic strength is not forged in comfort. It is built through resistance, through difficulty, and through a willingness to endure criticism in pursuit of something greater than approval. That is the cost of asserting a new direction. That is the price of national courage. Asterisk, every economic decision a nation makes, whether it's setting interest rates, levying taxes, or imposing tariffs, is more than just a technical adjustment. It is a reflection of values. It reveals what a society believes is worth protecting, what it is willing to sacrifice, and where it draws the line between necessity and excess. The notion that economic policy is purely mathematical is a dangerous illusion. Behind every percentage point and policy paper lies a moral framework, often unspoken but always active. When the United States decides to raise tariff revenue to $50 billion per month, it is not simply collecting money. It is making a moral choice about who bears the cost and who reaps the reward. The moral dimension of economic decision-making has been obscured in recent decades by the language of neutrality. Politicians and economists have often spoken as though markets are impartial, as though the laws of supply and demand operate without human influence or responsibility. But this is misleading. Every policy, every regulation, every trade agreement favors someone and burdens someone else. To pretend otherwise is not objectivity, is evasion. Tariffs, especially, are moral tools because they assign responsibility. They say, we will not accept goods made under exploitative conditions. We will not reward nations that suppress labor rights. We will not sacrifice our workers to satisfy abstract theories of efficiency. When a country raises tariffs, it is implicitly stating that certain outcomes, such as domestic manufacturing, job security, or economic independence are worth more than low prices on imported goods. It is claiming that some values cannot be outsourced, and that the health of a society cannot be judged solely by how cheaply it can consume. These are not just economic judgments, they are ethical ones. Touch on the deeper question of what kind of society we want to be, one that prioritizes the long-term dignity of its people, or one that chases short-term affordability at any cost. This moral clarity is especially important at a time when economic narratives are often dominated by technocratic jargon. We are told that protectionism is outdated, that global supply chains are inevitable, and that national industries must give way to international integration. But all of these arguments rest on unspoken moral premises that scale matters more than stability, that growth matters more than justice, and that efficiency matters more than sovereignty. If we accept these premises without question, we lose the ability to shape our own future. We become passive participants in someone else's story. To reassert moral agency in economic decision-making is not a rejection of logic or analysis. It is a necessary complement. Numbers must serve values, not replace them. A tariff policy that generates billions in revenue must be judged not just by how much money it brings in, but by what it protects, what it encourages, and what it says about our national priorities. It must be grounded in a clear understanding that economics is not morally neutral. It is a tool for either reinforcing or undermining the social fabric. Every dollar collected through tariffs carries with it a moral signature, a declaration of what we believe to be right, just worth preserving. Asterisk, choosing to prioritize long-term renewal over short-term comfort is perhaps one of the most difficult, but essential decisions any society can make. The modern economy, with its endless focus on speed, convenience, and instant gratification, has conditioned people to expect immediate results with minimal effort. Prices must stay low. Goods must arrive faster, and discomforting disruption to the norm is viewed with suspicion or even hostility. But the truth is, meaningful change rarely fits into this paradigm. National renewal, real, structural, and lasting, requires sacrifice, patience, the willingness to endure periods of difficulty without losing sight of the greater goal. Tariffs, especially those on the scale being discussed, $50 billion a month, inevitably create disruption. They reshape markets. They force businesses to adapt. They can raise costs in the short term and introduce friction into a system that has grown used to fluid, consequence-free consumption. But that friction is not failure. It is the necessary resistance that precedes transformation. Just as a muscle must be torn before it grows stronger, a nation must be willing to experience growing pains in the service of recovery. The discomfort caused by such policies is not arbitrary. It is purposeful. It's an investment in a future where the country is more stable, more resilient, and less dependent on the whims of foreign supply chains or exploitative trade deals. Citizens, too, must come to terms with this reality. The culture of entitlement that surrounds consumption must be replaced with a culture of contribution. Instead of asking only what can be acquired cheaply, people must begin asking what is being built, what is being preserved, and what future is being created by their economic behavior. This requires a shift in mindset from passive consumer to engaged citizen. It demands the ability to see beyond immediate transactions and to understand the deeper implications of where products come from, how they are made, and what systems are being reinforced by our purchasing habits. Policymakers bear a particular burden in this process. It is not enough to introduce tariffs or restructure trade deals. They must also communicate the why, the vision behind the discomfort. People are more willing to endure hardship when they believe it has purpose, when they understand that the cost today paves the way for strength tomorrow. Leaders must offer clarity, not just about economic goals, but about cultural and moral ones. They must be willing to speak to long-term aspirations in a world obsessed with the short-term metric. That takes courage, especially when critics are loud and results are slow to materialize. But this is the essence of leadership, to guide people not where they want to go now, but where they will be proud to have arrived later. It is about trading. Convenience for meaning, novelty for substance, and short-term applause for long-term strength. National renewal cannot come from comfort. It comes from deliberate, principled struggler, collective willingness to endure temporary pain in pursuit of a future that is not only economically sound, but morally grounded and culturally rooted. $50 billion in tariff revenue is more than a number, it's a declaration that we are ready to trade ease for endurance, dependence for strength, and short-term comfort for long-term sovereignty.